Okay, welcome back. Why don't we pick up just a little bit about the exam? We've got the feedback from the exam now, posted to BSpace. Remember, before the exam, I dropped item 12, which has to do with prototypes and exemplars, but I haven't dropped the topic, so don't be surprised if you see a question like that on the final exam. And also, items 15 and 16 turned out statistically to be a little problematic, so in order to erase those problems, I gave everybody full credit for them. So that's the story on that. We're going to distribute the exams, return the exams in your discussion sections this week. So there you have it. And if you have any questions about the scoring of your individual answers, we'll be happy to entertain those. But we have to set a deadline here. So by next Monday, a week from today, we'll want if you have any questions. And you can't just kind of turn the exam back in and say, I want to regrade, or even I want to regrade on question 8. What we want is a paragraph in writing that explains why you think your answer deserves more credit. Okay, so let us have that. There's a distribution of scores, pretty good distribution, not bad. If you take out the fact that nobody got less than 25, it's a nice normal distribution, so pretty happy with that. Okay, at the very beginning of the class, when we talked about differences between social and non-social cognition, I outlined a couple of quantitative differences, that is, differences in amount, where social cognition seemed to have more of a particular feature than non-social cognition. And then I talked about a number of what I thought of as qualitative differences, where there's a difference in kind, where there's a feature that social cognition has that non-social cognition just doesn't have at all. And the one I want to pick up on today is what's known as the subject-object distinction. In non-social cognition, that distinction is very clear. There's a subject who perceives or an object or remembers an event, and there's an object which is perceived or remembered. I'm here, that's a podium, that's my notes, that's my computer, that's you, whatever. There's a distinction here. But in social cognition, we've got this interesting case where the self is both the knower and the object of knowledge, which is to say, I don't just have knowledge about you guys, I have knowledge about myself. And that's quite different from what you see in non-social case. So this idea that the self is somehow important for understanding cognition in general goes back a long way to William James, who had this idea in his writings about consciousness. Take my consciousness course, you'll hear more about this. That one of the interesting things about consciousness is that there's a sense of ownership that a person has over his or her thoughts. That is, I've got thoughts running around in my head, and I know they're mine, and they're distinct from whatever thoughts you have that are running around in your head. But the way you put it is every thought is being owned. That is, you possess your own thoughts, your own percepts, your own memories. And then James has this extraordinary statement in which he says, on these terms, the personal self, rather than the thought, might be treated as the immediate datum for psychology. Now, James had already defined psychology as the science of mental life, and now he's saying, well, wait a minute, really, it's not just mental life, it's my mental life. There's this thing that thinks. The universal conscious fact is not feelings and thoughts exist, but I think and I feel. Sometimes it seems as if modern psychology has picked up maybe a little bit too much on James's ideas, because if you open to the index of any textbook in personality and social psychology, and you can do that with Fisk and Taylor, you'll see this huge assortment of terms that have self as part of them, probably a longer list of index terms than any other topic in personality or social psychology. These are just representative samples. I ran out of room on the slide for this. But again, this is just a little illustration of how important the self is as a topic in personality and social psychology. At the same time, we try to figure out exactly what we mean by the self. Again, modern scientific ideas about the self go back to James, like almost everything does. And James himself made this interesting distinction between three aspects of the self: the material self, the social self, and the spiritual self. By material self, what James meant to include all of the material things that belong somehow or that are associated with oneself, beginning with one's body, of course, and one's family relations, who your parents are, who your brothers and sisters are, who your children are. But interestingly, also your possessions, that the objects you possess, your car nowadays, your horse and buggy back then, your house, your iPad, whatever, are a part of yourself and are kind of an expression of yourself. Are you an Apple person? Are you a Mac person? Or are you a PC person? Do you have an iPhone? Or do you have an Android? Does that matter to you? Yes, it does. Okay, there are devout Android people out there, and that's kind of part of what they're like. Then there's the social self, which James defined as the self as he or she is viewed by other people. We have some kind of internal representation of that. And then finally, what James called the spiritual self, by which he didn't mean anything to do with religion exactly, but really had to do with more internal states of feeling and drives and motives and emotions and all of that kind of stuff. So in James's chapter on the self, this is what he's all about. He kind of talks about this as he thinks it's settled. But very quickly, it became clear that there were certain issues that were problematic about the self, and these were no place better expressed than by Gordon Allport, famous mid-century psychologist, who talked about this puzzling problem of the self when he asked, who is the I who knows the bodily me, who has an image of myself and sense of identity over time, who knows that I have appropriate striving, says that I want things. I know all these things and I know that I know them, but who is it who has this grasp of things? Allport concluded that it's much easier to feel the self, we all know we have one, than it is to define the self. Well, to be honest with you, I don't think that's right. I don't think it's all that hard to define the self. Nancy Cantor and I did it about 30 years ago, pretty quickly, when we talked about, viewed from the cognitive perspective, the self is nothing more, or less, for that matter, than one's mental representation of oneself. You have mental representations of other objects. When the self becomes an object of knowledge, you have a mental representation of yourself. You have some idea of what you're like as a person, and this mental representation consists, so we argue then, of the attributes that you have of which you're aware. Attributes including things like personality traits and characteristic behaviors. You know you're a neurotic extrovert or whatever it is you've got. You have some idea what your emotional life is like. You have some idea what your goals are like, what you look like, what your socioeconomic status is, what you've got, whether you've got an iPad or some other kind of tablet, what your relationships with others are like. These are your attributes from the point of view of personality and social psychology. And your ideas about these attributes, your mental representation of yourself in these terms, is what, from a cognitive perspective, we'd simply call the self. Okay, which is not to say that Cantor and I are smarter than Allport. Just we think about it differently. We say, look, from a cognitive point of view, it's not all that hard to figure out. Now, when you start talking about the self as one's mental representation of oneself, you begin to now ask a new set of questions. What do we mean by mental representation? John Anderson, a leading cognitive psychologist at Carnegie Mellon University, distinguishes between two basic forms of mental representation. The first, which he calls perception-based mental representations, are really like mental images. And what perception-based mental representations do is that they represent the physical appearance of an object, broadly construed to include things like spatial-temporal relations, where it is in space, what it's doing, what it was like before, and so on. These are thought about as analogs, almost like pictures in the head, if you will, and commonly referred to as mental images. Then, in addition to these perception-based representations of the self, we have these meaning-based representations that exist at a more abstract level than one that focuses on the perceptual details. They have to do not with the attributes themselves and what you look like, but kind of the meaning of things, the categories that things belong to. And what's distinctive about these meaning-based representations is that while perception-based representations have a kind of analog quality to them, they're like mental images or pictures in the head, these meaning-based representations are propositional in nature. They're like verbal descriptions of things. I am a neurotic extrovert. I'm a PC person, or whatever they might be. Another quick question.
Does our entire sense of self come from our senses, or are there any processes of our awareness that first starting with themselves?
Well, there's a big process that starts in the brain, and that's called thinking. Okay, so that remember in British empiricism, all knowledge is derived from the senses or your reflections on sense data. Okay, so a lot of these meaning-based representations are going to be derived from your reflections on yourself, but they'll be derived from other things too. You know, you go home and your roommate calls you a schmuck. You start thinking, oh, gee, maybe I'm not such a good person after all, right? It's got nothing to do with your self-image, your representation of yourself, but it does have something to do with now incorporating this verbal knowledge of what somebody else thinks about you. What we're going to do today is we're going to take these two themes and kind of work through them with respect to the self. We're going to talk first about the self as a meaning-based representation of oneself, and then I'm going to make time to talk about the self as a perception-based image. When you think about the meaning-based representations of the self, the first thing you think about is the self as concept. Now, that is, as you constitute a kind of class of objects that are different from everybody else. Your self-concept fundamentally has to do with your ideas of what makes you you. What makes you unique, different from all other people. And we have this term in ordinary language, self-concept, which, especially in California, tends to be limited to self-esteem and how good you think about yourself. But what we want to do, what Cantor and I tried to do, was to think about the self as a concept in very concrete terms. If the self is a concept, what does that concept look like? And as you know, all concepts have certain kinds of features in common. We commonly think about concepts as lists of attributes. So the self-concept would consist of a list of attributes that are somehow characteristic of ourselves and somehow serve to differentiate ourselves from other people. And as you'll remember from your reading, if not from any place else, we have these different views of how conceptual knowledge is organized. And we can use these views as a way of framing questions about what the self looks like viewed as a concept. So from the point of view of the classical view of concepts as proper sets, the self as a concept is a concept that consists of only a single instance, right? There's just one of you. This instance is represented in terms of a set of features that tend to set you yourself apart from all other people. Now, from the classical view of concepts as proper sets, what we want to think of is that there are these attributes out there that are singly necessary and jointly sufficient to distinguish oneself from all other people. And you can do that. You can all sit down right now, write in your notebooks a list of features that serve to distinguish yourself from all other people. But when you start doing that, you start figuring out that actually that's not a very interesting way to think about it. What distinguishes me from all other people, besides my DNA, which of course I'm not consciously aware of, is just parenthood. I'm the younger son of Harriet and Waldo, and that's it, right? There's nobody else like that. Despite the fact, in addition to the fact that the self as a proper set is boring, okay, the problem is that the idea of the self as a proper set really inherits all the problems that I talked about earlier with the classical view of categories as proper sets. We just don't want to go there. What we might want to do, however, is to think about the self as some kind of prototype, as a list of attributes that are not singly necessary and jointly sufficient to define the self, but rather tend to be characteristic of oneself, tend to set oneself apart from other people. And of course, you'll remember from the prototype view, each concept is represented by a prototype. So we say, okay, that's fine. We can think about a prototypical self. And the members of the category share a kind of family resemblance with each other. And the category prototype is abstracted from these. But already you can see what the problem is. If you're going to abstract a category prototype over a number of instances that share a family resemblance with each other, what's the problem? There's only one of you, right? What are you going to abstract across? Each self is unique, so that there isn't any family in that sense to have resemblance of, unless you think about things a little bit differently. And what we decided to do was to take inspiration from some older sociological theories of the self. Here's the Cooley, early sociologist, who argued that first the self is whatever attributes are associated with first-person pronouns, I, me, mine, whatever. But more interestingly, Cooley's concept of the looking glass self, where he argued that each person has as many selves as there are significant others in the environment. So there's not just one instance of me. I've got some sense of how I'm viewed by students. I've got some sense of how I'm viewed by my family. I've got some sense of how I'm viewed by my wife. I've got some sense of how I'm viewed by my cats or my neighbors or whatever. And those are all different selves that I've got sitting in my head. This is why Cooley calls it the looking glass self, because you're basically trying to look at yourself the way other people look at you. And the general idea here's the same kind of idea coming from George Herbert Mead. A person has as many selves as there are social roles for him to play. From the point of view of the self as a prototype, you can see now where you get multiple selves to abstract a prototype from, which is simply that we all play a number of roles. We all have a number of people, significant other people in our worlds. And each of those situations, each of those roles, each of those significant others is associated with a different self representation, and the self as prototype then would be abstracted across those. And the self as prototype would tend to have whatever the features that tend to be shared in common by those individual context-specific selves. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, these guys were all friends. Well, actually, at least Cooley and James were friends. And James understood that you did have a number of selves, okay? And they were context specific, and the context that they were specific to were social context. So James's idea of the social self is that, yeah, yourself is viewed by other people, but the next thing James would say is, well, there are lots of other people out there, and in order to have meaningful social exchange with each of them, you've got to have some idea of how they view you. So there you go. You've got this internal representation of that. Okay, so what we can now think of from a prototype view is that there's not just one self, one unitary monolithic self. In fact, we have internalized in our mental representations of ourselves a number of context-specific self-concepts. What I'm like at work, what I'm like at home, what I'm like at the neighborhood, what I'm like at the bar, all these kinds of different selves. And that these context-specific selves allow me to mentally represent the contextual variability in my own behavior. Behavior broadly construed to include thoughts and feelings and motives and all of that. And so if you want to think about the self as a prototype, you can think about the prototype as abstracted from all of these instances. So to put it simply, you've got a prototypical self which somehow abstracts across these more context-specific selves, like self with friends or self with family or self with significant others. Now, remember, especially from your reading, that the prototype view of the self solves a lot of the problems that beset the classical view of categories as proper sets, but it has some problems of its own, which is why some cognitive psychologists have proposed that we shift from a prototype view of categories to an exemplar view of categories. And what this has to do with is we don't have any abstract summary representation anymore. We just have mental representations of particular instances. And when you take this view of this exemplar view of categories and apply it to the self, what you've got is a whole bunch of different selves without any unifying prototype on top of it. So you've got the self with friends, and it just sits there as a mental representation, and the self with family and the self with significant other and all that. These are selves, but they're not united by anything. There's no prototypical self that is abstracted from these, and so there's no hierarchy of selves either. They're just all instances, the same way our concept of birds might contain a set of instances instead of just one single prototypical bird. There's a dramatic example of this in the literature. You don't see this too often, but you do see it from time to time in a form of mental illness known as multiple personality disorder, or is now known as dissociative identity disorder. And what happens here is that you encounter a patient who seems to possess a number of different identities. Each one is dominant over behavior at a particular time, and these identities are separated by a kind of interpersonality amnesia, where one identity doesn't know anything about the other identities. There's a classic case, famous book, famous movie remade, The Three Faces of Eve. Here we have Eve White, who was the person who was known to most of the people in her community, kind of reserved, introverted person. Then there was Eve Black, a very extroverted, gregarious, vivacious woman. And then you had a third personality who began to emerge in psychotherapy. These different personalities, so they were called, can also be thought of as different selves that coexisted with each other. Eve White didn't know anything about Eve Black or Jane. Jane knew all about Eve White. Eve Black knew all about Eve White. And Jane knew about Eve Black, but Eve Black didn't know about Jane. It's asymmetrical interpersonality amnesia. But this very dramatic case gives you some idea about what it might be like to have a whole bunch of individual exemplar selves that are essentially unrelated to each other. Okay, self is proper set. That's one view of the self concept. Self is prototype. That's a second view. Self is exemplars. That's the third view. We've got a fourth view of category structure that's beginning to emerge in cognitive psychology, and that is that we represent concepts not just as lists of features, not as lists of features at all, but rather as theories about the domain that they represent. You have a theory about birds that helps you identify things as a bird. You have a theory about storms that helps you identify things as storms or whatever. And Seymour Epstein, a distinguished psychologist at the University of Massachusetts, is the only person, to my knowledge, and he did it a long time ago, and nobody ever picked up on it, so they should have, the idea that in fact we might best think about the self concept as the theory one has about oneself, not just some grocery list of attributes, but rather some idea about why we are what we are, why we have the attributes that we have. As I say, this idea of Epstein's has not been implemented too much in research, which is too bad. For one, I think it's pretty promising. Though you can see foreshadowings of it in some aspects of popular culture. So, for example, if you go, you spend time with people who are members of so-called survivor movements, survivors of the Holocaust, survivors of 9/11, survivors of child abuse, or even there are these child of survivor movements where people will identify themselves as children of alcoholics, not alcoholics themselves, but children of alcoholics. What you see in these groups, in these individuals, is that they have a theory that explains how they became the people they were. Not just a list of their attributes, but an explanation of how those attributes came to be. So from the classical view, the prototype view, the exemplar view, the self is simply a list of this is what I'm like, okay? The theory-based concept of the self, which again you can see in popular culture, even if you can't see it in research, really goes deeper and tries to explain not just what I'm like, but how I became the person I am. Somebody who wants to get involved in research on self and the self concept, I think this theory-based view is extremely promising, and it's one that just hasn't been picked up on by anybody. Okay, yeah, this is good. I'm moving right along, so I'm trying to make room for some material on autobiographical memory on Wednesday. Okay, so self as concept exemplifies the idea that we have these meaning-based representations of ourselves, some idea of what we're like that can be represented in one way or another as a concept. Now let's switch to this idea that we have perception-based representations of ourselves. And here, the guiding metaphor is not the self as concept, but rather the self as image. And again, we have in popular discourse this notion of a self-image, but again, in popular discourse, this notion of self-image tends to be focused on self-esteem. Oh, she's got a poor self-image or something like that. What we want to do again is to be really concrete, okay, and to talk about the self as image in terms of one's internal mental representation